Let's stay on the topic of the Reserve Bank and the appointment of the new governor, Michele Bullock. Joining me now is Adam Creighton, the Washington correspondent at the Australian newspaper. Adam, thanks for your time. You've also worked at the RBA earlier in your career. I believe Michele Bullock may have hired you. Yeah. So what do you make of her personality and temperament?
Yes, that's right, actually. Look, well, firstly, that was quite some time ago, and I never got to be as senior as Peter did. It was for a few years in the early 2000s. But yes, both Lucy Ellis and Michele were on the panel that hired me, and I still remember that day. I was very nervous, and fortunately they picked me as one of the cadets for that year. Look, I mean, Michele, I think, will be a great governor. She's the safe choice. She's a very likeable, kind woman. She puts people at ease very much. She's not scary in any way. She's from the country, just like Phil Lowe, actually. She's from the regions of New South Wales. I think it's interesting that she got a PhD from not from MIT, which is the glorious university in the US, which I think maybe too many elite central bankers have gone to recently, leading to some groupthink. So I think that's a good thing, but it's difficult for her. But she's going to be entering a governorship where she won't have as much power, if you like, as the former governor, because of these new reforms that you've just been talking about, where there'll be more boards, there'll be more economists, there'll be more disagreement, and in my view, there'll be too many chefs in the kitchen, if you like. And I mean, I don't support these reforms. I think it's a mistake, but it's kind of change for the sake of change. And you were talking about the Reserve Bank's culture there. I don't see what really had to change. I mean, the Reserve Bank is probably the finest public institution in Australia, at least according to the evidence, has very high standards, the highest standards, I would say, of any public agency. So you want to be careful before you play around with that.
Yeah, cash rate currently at 4.1%, inflation in Australia close to 6%. Do you think Michele's going to be effective in bringing down inflation quickly enough without tipping the economy into a recession?
Well, it's harder to say in Australia because you've got such a high share of home loans that are variable, and that's it's a big difference from the US or the UK, where it's a much smaller share. So those increases in rates do have a big hit on a large share of households. But look, the news is good from the US. I mean, we see here that we've had, the cash rate here is 5.25, the expectation of another couple of interest rate rises here, but the US economy continues to go gangbusters despite that, and despite the fact that all of those monetary policy experts that you were talking about before got the forecast repeatedly wrong. They said that there'd be a recession now, and there's not a recession. And of course, a year ago they said there'd be no inflation or little, and there was a lot. So we have to be careful before we put too much wisdom in these so-called monetary policy experts. But the practical news, as I say, is good. The US is not in recession, and so I think we could assume from that you'll get a soft landing in Australia as well. With that caveat, of course, that the home loans are the variable rate home loans. But that said, I think Peter's right. There will be a couple more increases. It's just 4.1% the cash rate in Australia, which is markedly lower than here, and also the UK, I think. So you're going to see some catch up, and I think he's right. You'll probably see another 75 basis points, 100 basis points.
Michele spoke last month about full employment, basically saying the unemployment rate needs to rise to 4.5% in Australia to tame inflation. This upset quite a few union groups, one of them saying it was shameful. Yeah. So do you think having the unions offside before starting the new job, is this a difficult situation for her?
Well, look, this has been a problem for central banking for decades. There's always been this emphasis on inflation in central banks, and trade unions have a much greater preference for employment for obvious reasons. I would say that, Michele, you shouldn't have said that, because I think we've seen the past couple of decades that the correlation between inflation and the unemployment rate is not what it used to be in the 70s. In other words, you can have a very low unemployment rate and low inflation, and vice versa. So I think, it shows maybe too much confidence in these old monetary theories, which I think personally are breaking down. I mean, we're seeing around the world now, we have quite high interest rates and there's no recession. So that suggests that there's something wrong with the monetary policy models that were forecasting a year ago that we would be in recession now. And then those same models, as I said earlier, were forecasting inflation would stay low, and it didn't. So of course, now we're seeing inflation come down around the world. All the central banks are going to say, it's because of our wonderful monetary policy. But I mean, really, is it? I mean, the same people were saying last year that the rising inflation was someone else's fault. So it's more art than science, central banking. And I think the fact that Michele does come from the payment system side of the bank, the financial stability side of the bank, is a good thing, because that's, they are the nuts and bolts areas of the bank, especially the payment system. And that's an area where the Reserve Bank can have a huge impact. And I mean she cut her teeth on the MasterCard reforms, the Visa reforms in the early 2000s when Australia went out on its own in the world effectively and slashed those interchange fees. They were challenged in the High Court. They won in the end. But it was a very good reform, and Michele should be very proud of that.
Yeah, US inflation for the month of June, the figures just came out this week showing inflation has cooled to about 3%. When you look at the US compared to Australia, just how much further ahead are America when it comes to interest rates and fighting inflation to where we are on Australian shores?
Well, look, it's hard to know. 3 to 6 months, I'd probably say. I mean, that's what you'd infer from looking at the charts. I think people are shocked how quickly the headline inflation rates come down. It was 9.1% last year. It's 3% now, as you said. Although it's worth pointing out that core inflation is still 4.5-ish, which is more than double the Fed's target. It must be said. So there's still some work to go. But just to stress the surprise of the resilience in the US economy, and indeed the Australian economy, you've had these significant increases in rates. The jobless rate remains very low.
Adam, thanks so much for your time. We've run out of time on the show.